Professor Maria José Barbosa is a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Iowa. She specializes in Brazilian literature and culture and the Portuguese language. She also teaches the Spanish language, and I believe, Professor Barbosa, that this is the first conversation that you and I have had in English. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's start by talking about the Portuguese language, which I believe is one of the languages that has the most misconceptions applied to it by people who don't speak it. Do you find that a lot of people just don't understand what they are talking about when they talk about the Portuguese language?
What are the misconceptions that you think people have about Portuguese?
Well, the misconception that I hear most often is that the language is only spoken in Portugal, but in fact it's spoken in many other countries, correct?
Exactly. Portuguese, actually in South America, Portuguese is more spoken than Spanish. When you combine all the other countries that speak Spanish in South America, there's about approximately 201 million people who speak Spanish in South America, and more than 203 million people who speak Portuguese in Brazil.
Okay, now how did that happen, that about half of the population of South America speaks Portuguese?
Because, the colonization of Brazil was Portuguese colonization, whereas the other one was Spanish colonization. The other countries were Spanish. And so that's another misconception, that they think that we speak Spanish in Brazil.
Right.
That's one of the major misconceptions, you know. And so when they realize that we speak Portuguese, they don't understand how different it is from Spanish or how similar.
That's right. A lot of people seem to think that Portuguese is just a dialect of Spanish, that it's almost the same thing, but it's not. They're not really mutually intelligible, are they?
No, you speak both languages now.
No, I don't. I can read Spanish a little bit, and I can sort of understand it, but I can't really speak it.
Oh, you can't? I thought you did.
No, I speak French fairly well.
You speak French and Italian, I see.
A little Italian, that's right.
Yeah. So, but I don't speak Spanish fluently.
Okay.
I studied some. I understand it absolutely perfect, but I think there is deep down, there is a part of me that really wanted to make sure that people know that my major language is Portuguese. I mean, English is my second language, but so I know the differences enough to call attention in the classroom all the time and say, this is Spanish, this is Portuguese, and etc. I studied it, but I'm not fluent in Spanish.
Right.
You know?
Now, I've been told that generally speaking, a Portuguese speaker can understand someone speaking Spanish, but not the other way around. Is that true?
Yes, it is, in general. There's a lot of discussions the reasons why people who speak Spanish it's not easy for them to understand us. And a lot of linguists, and this is not anything that I saw in a research publication, but a lot of the discussions that I've heard is that we do have in Portuguese a wider range of vowels.
That's right, you do.
You do. You know, you speak French, so you know we have some of the sounds of French. You speak Italian, you know we have some of the endings that Italian has. And especially with the nasal sounds.
Right.
And
when
vowels.
When you're speaking Portuguese, you got to get that buzz going on up here.
Exactly. So we say Janeiro, Rio de Janeiro, you know.
Sim.
So
muito bom.
Muito bom, muito bem. Né? And so it might be one of the reasons that we have that wider range of sounds, that it's easier to go from a more complex set of sounds to not that it's less complex in the sense of that it is inferior or less, but it's from a wider range to a smaller range, to a narrow range. Yeah? Right,
exactly. And as I understand it, there's really quite a difference in the vocabulary as well. You have different words in Spanish and Portuguese. They mean entirely different things.
Yeah, I would say even in English, I mean, the words in English that come from Latin may have a completely different meaning. I can give you an example. The word exquisito, exquisite in English, exquisito in Spanish is the same meaning of English. It's a positive thing. In Portuguese, it means weird, odd, different, you know? So there are some like that. But usually if you know Spanish, it can help you, at least at the beginning, to learn Portuguese more quickly.
Right, and I get the impression also that the music of the language is very different from Spanish to Portuguese. I find the music of the Portuguese language much more attractive than Spanish, just as I find the music of French more attractive than Italian.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm biased, you know, so in order for me to agree with you, it's my first language, I like it, but quite often I hear that from people, even when I'm in my office talking to students or to the TAs, and my colleague next door, you know, is listening to our overhears the conversation, and he tells me, it sounds so musical, you know? There is that sing-song,
yes,
you know, sing-song rhythm to it, yeah?
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that in the course of this interview. But first I'd like to talk about just the importance of learning foreign languages generally. A lot of people say that it's just not important to learn another language anymore because everybody speaks English. And certainly English is becoming a more universal language.
Yeah.
But is it still important to learn other languages, and why is it important if it is?
Well, not just for the reason of learning a language per se, but even for scientific reasons. I am not a specialist in theory of second language acquisition or foreign language acquisition, but it is a widespread idea. There's enough evidence from researchers from England. Canada has put out a lot of research, United States, in which it has shown that the learning a language is as positive as learning to play a musical instrument in the way that it affects your brain.
Uh-huh.
So it helps people, the brain, not to age, or people can score better in certain standardized tests. Tests if they know more than one language, if they know a foreign language.
Okay, and I suppose that like a musical instrument, it's better if you start young than if you start when you're fully grown.
They say for languages, one of the theories is that if you learn it before you are 12 years old, you speak it without an accent. Right. Or most probably, you will speak it without an accent. If you learn it after 12, but I've known cases of people that it's very hard to tell that they have an accent and they learned it an older age, you know.
It can be done, but you have to really work on the accent.
Accent. But, you know, I mean, I speak English with, you know, an accent, a thick accent sometimes.
Well, yes, but I can understand you perfectly well.
Exactly. That's my point, that, you know, I mean, you can make yourself understandable in any language. And also, some people think, they say, oh, I cannot learn languages. I have a disability to learn languages. I don't believe in that. I think anybody can learn anything. Some people have just a gift for learning language. They can, like people have a gift for playing an instrument.
Right.
You know, or painting or something. It comes naturally to some other people have to work harder, but anybody, in my opinion, can learn a language. It requires dedication. As you know, you speak several languages. It requires dedication, time, drive, interest, passion, you know. All of that plays a part in how well you can learn one or more other languages.
Okay, did you always want to be a teacher of languages, or is this something that you fell into later on in life?
I've always liked literature, and I always wanted to do something with languages and literatures, but teaching language per se was not my first goal. Is that when a lot of times people who are also in literature, in Italian, in French, and in Spanish, and Portuguese, end up also teaching language because that's part of the curriculum, you know?
Okay.
And I took a liking for it. I like to see, it is rewarding to see people blossoming and really being able to suddenly, at the end of a semester, communicate in a language that they didn't know before, you know?
That's true, yeah. So you grew up in Brazil, obviously, but where exactly?
I'm from Minas Gerais. Minas
Okay.
Gerais is a state in the southeast of Brazil. It's the
Right.
most industrialized part of
Minas
Brazil.
Gerais means General Mines, right?
Exactly. That was where we had the gold rush, the diamond rush of the 17th and 18th century. That was the second economic cycle of Brazil happened in that area. That's what the name Minas Gerais, General Mines. And some people say that the gold from Minas supported the Industrial Revolution in England because it would go through Portugal to England.
Of course.
Yeah.
Right. And you were educated where?
I did my BA, my bachelor's in letters, Portuguese and English, at Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Federal University of Minas Gerais. And then from there, I was invited to apply for comparative literature in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Okay.
So I did my MA and my PhD there. And then I worked a few years at University of Arizona, and then I came to the University of Iowa.
Okay, so for a long time, you had the ambition to come to the United States for at least part of your education.
Yeah. At the time that I came to the United States, the scholarships that they were giving in Brazil for me to do a master's were not something that I would leave a job to go do that.
Right.
And then when they offered me a teaching assistantship here, it meant that I had enough as a teaching assistant in the United States to support myself and at the same time get a higher education without having to get 2 or 3 jobs.
Okay. So what generally goes into being a professor of any language, but Portuguese specifically? What do you teach? How do you teach it? What does your day look like?
Well, it depends on the semester, on what I'm teaching, but it's always, there are several components in teaching a language like Portuguese, which it's less studied than Spanish. My colleagues in Spanish can be specialists. They teach only Golden Age, they only teach 20th century, this or that, because there is a large, 1,000 students.
Right.
No? In Portuguese and perhaps Italian as well, or other languages that are less taught and less spoken, or less studied, I would say, then we have to be what I call a generalist.
Right.
So I teach language, I also teach cultural studies, I teach literature, and you are all over the board, In a way, you get to know the students better. And also, I developed interests because I had to teach certain courses. And I started publishing in cultural studies, for instance, something that 15 years, 20 years ago, I had never thought of doing.
Right.
So it's like get up, prepare classes, grade, go to class, do research as well,
Right.
We have a service component.
Exactly. And you teach all kinds of students from very beginners to intermediate to advanced
Yeah.
and graduate students as well.
Yeah, the graduate students, mostly I work with them when I am in dissertation committees and things like that. And we do have graduate, because we only offer an undergraduate program in Portuguese. Same thing in Italian. Italian only has but we do have students, for instance, French and Italian. They have students from French who are also interested in Italian, and they might combine the degree or do the dissertation, a comparative dissertation. The same thing happens in Portuguese. Sometimes we get graduate students who want to declare or to have one area of their PhD to be Portuguese, or either continental Portuguese or Brazil, in literature of Brazil, literature of Portugal, or the African-speaking countries, the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa.
Yeah, and you mentioned Brazilian Portuguese versus continental Portuguese. They're very different, aren't they?
They are.
It's almost a bigger difference than the one between American English and British English.
Yes, some people say so. I had a professor in social linguistics once that called our attention to something that I never forgot. He said that actually, because when you look at the Portuguese spoken in Brazil, we relax on the vowels.
Right.
It's very more musical. In Portugal, they compress the vowels,
right,
as you know. When you compare the English spoken in England and here, for instance, we open, the English spoken here is more relaxed.
Right.
Canada, the same thing happens with French, he told us.
Right.
And so he said that sometimes you can go back to medieval times.
Right.
And in some ways, the reason why we speak Portuguese in Brazil the way we do English and French the way we do in the Americas, it's because that somehow it was the way it was spoken in medieval times. I don't know if my professor was right or no, but it does make sense.
Right. And some people would say that the Brazilian language sings while the Portuguese language has more of a lilt.
Yeah. Essa de Queiroz said in the 19th century that Brazilian Portuguese, or the Portuguese spoken in Brazil, was Português com açúcar, Portuguese with sugar.
Right. So could you give our viewers a demonstration of the difference between how Brazilian Portuguese sounds and how continental Portuguese sounds?
Well, if you help me, I'll say it in Brazilian Portuguese and you say it in continental Portuguese. Can you do that?
I can try.
Okay. I'll give one word and then we'll begin. For instance, I would say the word telephone. I would say telefone.
Right. And I would be more inclined to say telephone.
Telephone. See, you sort of eat the vowels,
right,
you know? Another very common thing is that we do not like consonants by themselves.
Right.
So we insert an I, the E sound, which E in Portuguese would be the I in English. I would say, instead of saying lawyer is advogado. Né?
Right.
In Brazil, we say advogado.
Right.
That's why the pronunciation of English words are so interesting in Brazilian Portuguese.
That's right.
Because you say cheesy instead of cheese. Né?
And you don't want to, in Brazilian Portuguese, you don't want to end a word with a consonant. I noticed that when we had the big football game a few weeks ago between Iowa and Iowa State, and the Brazilian students were all rooting for Iowa to beat Iowa State.
That's a good example. A good example. You know, it's this idea. I think in Italian is similar. You have this concept of consonant vowel or vowel by itself,
right,
to form a syllable. So for us, if you have ad, which is ad, you have to say advogado. Psicologia, psychology. Psicologia instead of psicologia.
Right. And in Brazilian Portuguese, very often, if a T or a D is followed by an E or an I, then it becomes a CH or a J. For example, if you're saying hello to somebody, you'd say bom dia. In Portugal, you'd say bom dia.
Bom dia. In the northeastern part of Brazil, that's where the Portuguese first arrived in Brazil, there is still a stronger influence from Portugal there. In the very south of Brazil, in Florianópolis, and in the northeastern part, they do say dia and kia instead of, but the majority, the other parts of Brazil, they are places where there's a larger population, the southeast mainly,
right,
which dictates some of the rules for the country, you know.
Right, but I understand there's also quite a difference between the accent of Rio and the accent of Sao Paulo, for example.
Yeah, do you know why?
No. I think it's because the Braganças were in Rio, and they spoke with the continental accent.
Exactly. For 13 years, Rio de Janeiro was so-called the capital of Portugal, because of the royal family lived there,
right.
escaping the Napoleonic Wars.
That's right. In case our viewers don't know, what happened was that Napoleon took over Portugal in the early part of the 19th century. The Portuguese royal family, their name was Bragança, they all took off and settled in Brazil and set up a government in exile there. And they were in Rio de Janeiro, which at the time was the capital of Brazil. And so because the Braganças were there speaking their continental Portuguese, they influenced that area. Whereas in Sao Paulo, you didn't have that influence.
No, and so everybody wanted to speak the way that the court spoke.
That's right.
So that's why they was called the Chiado.
Okay. And then there's also a tremendous difference, it seems to me, between the character of typical, if there's such a thing, typical Brazilian and the typical Portuguese. Somebody once said that the difference is the Brazilians have carnaval, the Portuguese have fado. Can you explain that to our viewers?
Yeah. Fado is the national music of Portugal. The themes are sad.
Right, it's a type of song. It's generally a very sad, sentimental type of song.
Sentimental type. And it's the idea that the carnival versus the fado it can be considered a generalization. And I like any time that we're trying to define people in countries through one single definition, popularly that's how it's said. They also think that Brazilians are always on the street singing and dancing, and so it also varies from country to region, from time to time,
That's right. When I was starting out taking elementary Portuguese, I remember in the text they had a picture of Carmen Miranda standing next to, standing next to Amália Rodrigues, who is, Carmen Miranda being a very popular Brazilian singer of the mid part of the 20th century, and Amália Rodrigues is was a fadista. She sang Portuguese fado music. She was the most famous practitioner of that. So you have Carmen Miranda standing there with that famous hat that she wore with the fake fruit on it, and Amália Rodrigues standing there in her somber black dress with the single strand of pearls around her neck, and there's a little caption where she's saying, "Que estranha moda da vida." What a strange way of life.
Yeah. But, the funny thing about it is that Carmen Miranda was born in Portugal.
Was she?
Yes. And Portugal actually claims Carmen Miranda now because she lived in the States. She became famous here. Most people know her because of the hats, as you mentioned, and the films that she made in Hollywood. She was, at one point, the best paid person in Broadway.
I did not know that.
Yes. And there is a famous a sentence attributed to her that's called "Bananas is my business," because they say she didn't know how to make the agreements,
Right.
And there is a film called "Bananas in My Business," which is a biography of her. Talks about her time here as well, and she was very famous. But Portugal claims her. I said, no, she's Portuguese. She was born in Portugal. I think, if I remember correctly, she was 2 years old when she went. The family moved to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro.
But one way or another, the musical tradition is very important both to Brazil and to Portugal. And that was really how I was drawn to the Portuguese language, because I used to listen to fado music as a kid, and then when I got a little older, I started taking an interest in Brazilian pop, and I became acquainted with Milton Nascimento, Flora Purim, Simone, Gilberto Gil, and a lot of others.
Oh, I didn't know you know all those people.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Milton Nascimento is from Minas Gerais.
Yes, that's right.
A lot of Minas has a tradition not only of precious stones, but also a lot of the great writers of Brazil, of literature and music.
Right.
So it's it's a good tradition. It is. A lot of times I like to think about Portugal and Brazil not as contrasts but as complementary sides.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, because there is not animosity or anything in Brazil against the Portuguese. Of course, after the independence, there was a period in which, they didn't want to do anything to do with Portugal, but the relations have been always more than just cordial.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there are other countries besides where Portuguese is generally spoken, correct?
I'm sorry.
There are other countries where Portuguese is spoken.
Yeah.
Angola, Mozambique.
Yeah, the Portuguese is the official language of 8 countries.
Uh-huh.
And besides Portugal and Brazil, we have the African countries, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guiné-Bissau, Porto-Príncipe, and also Portuguese. Now it's not spoken as much, but it's still a dialect in Goa in India.
Right.
In Macau in China.
Right. You often meet Indians who speak Portuguese, probably because of that.
Yeah, I was looking at the job market, the offers of job for people who are in Portuguese, and there was an offer of a job this year in Macau. And I thought they're contracting, they're hiring people, they are announcing internationally to hire people to continue the tradition of the Portuguese language in Macau.
Okay, and are you ever tempted by that, or have you put down roots here in Iowa?
I put roots in Iowa. I've been here for more than 18 years. I've become an Iowan, I think.
Well, good.
Yeah.
And this is a small thing, but I have to bring it up. My very favorite Portuguese word, because it's so useful, and we don't have an equivalent of it in English, and that word is saudade. And I come back to that word in my writing, when I'm writing novels, when I'm writing essays. I wish that there were an English equivalent of that word. Can you explain to our viewers what that word means and why it is so peculiar to the Portuguese language?
I think every language has one word that cannot be translated. There is no translation, a direct translation, exact translation for it. I heard many explanations for saudade. Saudade is that deep longing.
Right. It's more than nostalgia.
Yes.
It wrenches your heart.
It does.
Sometimes it's a longing for something that never really was, but it's an ideal that you've got in your head.
It can be for something real, really real also. Saudades de pão de queijo.
Right.
Saudades do Brasil, né?
Right. Or a man might feel saudade for a girl that he fell in love with and makes her up to be much more wonderful than she was in real life.
When William Hurt won the Oscar for The Kiss of the Spider Woman that was shot in Brazil, when he received the Oscar, that's what he said. He raised it and said, "Saudades do Brasil."
Okay.
So, I mean, it's like I miss Brazil deeply,
Okay. And probably you have saudade for Brazil every now and then, but not enough to steal you away from us here in Iowa. We are very glad to have you as a professor in the Spanish and Portuguese Department of the University of Iowa. Thank you very much for appearing on the show, Professor Barbosa, and thank you all.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.